There is a person you have met. You may not have recognized them at the time. They were too warm for that. Too present. Too genuinely, disarmingly interested in everything you had to say. They remembered the small things, the name of your sister, the project you were anxious about, the offhand comment you made 3 weeks ago that you had already forgotten. They had a quality of attention that felt, in a world of constant distraction, almost radical. You felt seen by them. Fully, completely, unusually seen. And that feeling, that specific warmth of being understood by someone who seems to understand everyone, drew you closer. Of course it did. It was designed to. Here is what you did not know in that moment. What almost nobody knows, because the research on this personality type is barely a decade old and has not yet filtered into the cultural conversation the way it needs to. The attention was real. The understanding was genuine. The empathy was not performed. And that is precisely what made it dangerous. Because what you were encountering was not the cold calculation of the classic manipulator. Not the obvious charm of the narcissist who flatters without listening. What you were encountering was something the psychological literature has only recently begun to name and map. A personality configuration so paradoxical, so counterintuitive, so contrary to everything we assume about how empathy works, that most people cannot recognize it even after it has already caused significant damage. Dark empathy. Welcome to the Echo Principle. Tonight we map the most dangerous personality type you have probably never heard of. And by the end of this conversation, you will never mistake genuine warmth for safety again. We need to begin by dismantling an assumption so deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of human psychology that it operates almost as an axiom. Empathy is good. Not just good in the moral sense. Good in the functional sense. The assumption is that empathy, the capacity to understand and share the feelings of another person, is inherently prosocial. That it produces kindness. That it generates connection. That the more empathy a person has, the less likely they are to cause harm. This assumption is wrong. Not partially wrong. Structurally wrong. Wrong in a way that, once you see it, reorganizes your entire understanding of what empathy actually is and how it actually operates. The error begins with a failure to distinguish between two fundamentally different processes that the word empathy collapses into a single concept. The first is affective empathy. The automatic, largely involuntary capacity to feel what another person feels. To experience something like their emotional state in your own nervous system. This is the empathy that makes you wince when someone cuts their finger. That makes you cry at a film about strangers. That produces the chest tightness of secondhand embarrassment. The second is cognitive empathy. The ability to understand, model, and predict what another person is feeling, without necessarily feeling it yourself. To construct an accurate map of someone else's emotional state using intellectual processing rather than emotional resonance. These two processes are neurologically distinct. They activate different brain regions. They develop through different pathways. And crucially, they can exist in almost any combination. High affective, high cognitive, the genuinely compassionate person. High affective, low cognitive, the person who feels deeply but cannot always understand. Low affective, high cognitive, and here is where it gets interesting. To understand dark empathy, we need to first understand the framework it emerged from. The dark triad. In 2002, psychologists Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams identified a cluster of 3 personality traits that consistently co-occur and that share a common core of callousness and interpersonal manipulation. Narcissism, the excessive self-focus, the hunger for admiration, the sense of entitlement. Machiavellianism, the strategic, calculating approach to social interaction, the willingness to manipulate and deceive in pursuit of goals. And psychopathy, the emotional detachment, the reduced capacity for fear and remorse, the tendency toward impulsivity and risk-taking. The dark triad became one of the most studied constructs in personality psychology. And the research consistently showed that individuals high in dark triad traits were more likely to engage in exploitative, antisocial behavior across virtually every domain of life, relationships, workplace dynamics, financial dealings, and beyond. But here was the puzzle that the research kept running into. The classic dark triad profile, the cold, calculating, emotionally detached manipulator, was relatively easy to identify over time. Because they lacked the one thing that makes sustained social manipulation genuinely effective: the ability to read people accurately, to feel the temperature of a room, to know, in real time, exactly what someone needs to hear and exactly how they need to hear it. The cold Machiavellian could construct a strategy, but they often missed the nuance, the emotional texture, the specific vulnerability that makes a particular person susceptible to a particular approach. And then researchers began looking at a subset of individuals who scored high on dark triad traits, but who also scored high on empathy measures. And what they found was something that fundamentally changed the field. In 2020, psychologist Nadia Haim and her colleagues at Nottingham Trent University published research that introduced the term dark empathy into the psychological literature. Their study used a large sample of participants and assessed them across both dark triad traits and empathy dimensions. What they found, when they mapped the data, was not the simple relationship the field had assumed. It was not the case that dark triad traits and empathy existed on opposite ends of a single spectrum. Instead, the data revealed four distinct personality clusters. The typical group, scoring average on both dark traits and empathy. The dark triad group, scoring high on dark traits and low on empathy, the classic profile. The empathic group, scoring low on dark traits and high on empathy, the genuinely prosocial profile. And a fourth group, one that previous research had largely missed. A group that scored high on dark triad traits, the narcissism, the Machiavellianism, the psychopathy, and also scored high on empathy. Particularly on cognitive empathy. The ability to read and model other people's emotional states with precision. Haim and her colleagues called this group the dark empaths. And their findings about this group were, in the precise language of academic psychology, alarming. Dark empaths scored higher on social skills compared to the typical dark triad profile. They came across as warm and likable. They were better at building connections and keeping them going over long periods of time. All of these qualities combined made them more capable of causing lasting harm to the people around them. The truth is, the most difficult person to spot is always the one who seems the most trustworthy. Let us make this concrete. Let us examine not a name, but a pattern. The pattern that appears, with remarkable consistency, in the documented history of individuals who caused extraordinary psychological harm through the specific mechanism of weaponized empathy. The profile begins not with cruelty but with attunement. The dark empath enters a new social environment and, with a speed and accuracy that strikes observers as almost supernatural, maps the emotional landscape. Who is lonely? Who is ambitious but insecure? Who is grieving something they haven't told anyone about? Who needs to be the smartest person in the room? Who needs to be protected? Who needs to be challenged? This mapping is not calculated in the way we imagine calculation. It is not slow and deliberate. It is fast, intuitive, and experienced from the inside as natural social interest. As genuine curiosity about people. And in a significant sense, it is genuine. The cognitive empathy is real. The reading is accurate. The interest, in its own way, is authentic. What is not present, or present only in severely diminished form, is the moral break. The automatic recognition that the information being gathered about another person's vulnerability carries an ethical weight. That it creates a kind of responsibility. For the dark empath, the accurate reading of another person's emotional state is experienced primarily as information. Useful information. Information that can be deployed. The kindness that follows the reading is real. The care is real. But it is instrumentalized care. Care in service of a deeper agenda that the dark empath may not even be fully conscious of. That operates beneath the level of deliberate strategy, as a deeply embedded interpersonal orientation. Give people exactly what they need. Until you need something from them. Let us go deeper into the specific mechanics. Because understanding the mechanism is the only reliable protection against it. The first phase is mirroring. The dark empath reflects back to the target an idealized version of themselves. They do not simply agree with everything the target says. That would be too obvious, too easily recognized as flattery. They engage. They push back slightly, in ways that feel like genuine intellectual interest. They remember. They follow up. They demonstrate, through accumulated small acts of attention, that this person matters to them in a way that feels specific and chosen. The effect on the target is profound. Because what is being activated is one of the deepest human needs, the need to be known. Not admired in the generic sense. Known. Seen in the specificity of who you actually are rather than the performance of who you present yourself to be. The second phase is the gradual installation of dependency. As the relationship deepens, the dark empath becomes, subtly and without announcement, the primary emotional reference point for the target. The person whose opinion matters most. Whose presence is most regulating. Whose absence creates a specific quality of discomfort that the target learns to call missing them. This happens through availability engineering. The dark empath is not always available. They are available at precisely the right moments, the moments of vulnerability, of need, of emotional elevation, and intermittently unavailable at others. Creating, through variable reinforcement, the neurological signature of attachment that is almost identical to the pattern produced by anxious attachment in early childhood. The target is now, in the most clinical sense of the word, hooked. This is the dimension of dark empathy that causes the most confusion, the most self-doubt, the most lasting psychological damage. When someone is overtly cruel, when the abuse is obvious, when the manipulation is visible, when the harm is undeniable, there is at least a coherent narrative available. This person hurt me. This relationship was bad. I need to leave. The dark empath does not give you that narrative. Because alongside everything harmful, there is also something real. The connection was real. The moments of genuine understanding were real. The warmth, in its strange and complicated way, was real. The target is not wrong to have felt those things. They were not imagining them. They were not naive. The good was genuinely there. It was simply in service of something else. This creates a cognitive and emotional situation of extraordinary complexity. The target cannot simply say, "That was all fake." Because it wasn't all fake. They cannot simply say, "I should have seen it coming." Because the whole architecture was designed to be invisible. They cannot even fully articulate what happened, because the harm was not delivered through obvious cruelty but through something that felt, at every individual moment, like care. The damage accumulates not in dramatic incidents but in a slow erosion of the target's relationship with their own perception. Over time, in a relationship with a dark empath, the target learns not to trust their own reading of situations. Not to trust their own emotional responses. not to trust the quiet instinct that something is off. Because every time that instinct has surfaced, it has been met with such warm, reasonable, genuinely empathic explanation of why the instinct is wrong. Let us move this out of the intimate relationship context, where it is most commonly discussed, and into the professional environment. Because dark empathy does not limit itself to romantic partnerships. It operates with equal or greater effectiveness in organizational hierarchies. The workplace dark empath is often among the most well-liked people in any organization. They are the colleague who remembers birthdays, who checks in during difficult periods, who advocates visibly for their team members in public settings. They are perceived as emotionally intelligent, as genuinely people-focused, as the human counterweight to the cold logic of institutional decision-making. They are also, quietly and consistently, managing perception, accumulating social capital with the precision of an investor who understands that goodwill is a form of currency. Building relationships not merely because relationships are valuable in themselves, but because relationships are the primary mechanism through which organizational power is acquired and maintained. The specific harm they cause in professional contexts tends to be structural rather than acute. They do not typically engage in overt sabotage. They operate through selective information sharing, knowing what to tell whom, and when, and how. Through credit management, being genuinely helpful in ways that create obligation, and subtly ensuring that the help is visible to the right people. Through loyalty engineering, creating around themselves a network of people who feel personally indebted to them, and who will, in moments of organizational conflict, act as advocates without fully understanding why they feel so strongly. The people who eventually see it clearly are usually the ones who stopped being useful. This is the question that every person who has encountered a dark empath eventually arrives at. Usually after they have already invested significantly in the relationship. Usually after the pattern has become clear enough to name, but the attachment has become strong enough to make leaving feel like self-amputation. Can they change? The honest answer is rarely, and only under very specific conditions. The core challenge is that the dark empath's personality configuration is not experienced by the dark empath as a problem. The narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic traits that characterize the dark side of the profile are egosyntonic. They feel consistent with the self, not alien to it. The dark empath does not typically experience their interpersonal style as exploitative. They experience it as skilled, as sophisticated, as simply understanding how people work and being effective with that understanding. Research on therapeutic outcomes for individuals high in dark triad traits is sobering. Traditional therapeutic approaches that rely on the development of emotional insight, on the cultivation of empathy for others, face an obvious structural challenge with clients who already have high cognitive empathy and have learned to deploy therapeutic language with considerable facility. The dark empath can discuss their patterns with apparent insight, can generate compelling narratives of self-understanding, can perform the emotional labor of therapeutic work with an accuracy that is difficult to distinguish from genuine progress. What is considerably harder to produce is the genuine experience of another person's pain as a moral claim on one's behavior. The felt sense of responsibility that makes not causing harm feel like more than a strategic choice. Change is possible. It requires sustained motivation, which typically only emerges from consequences significant enough to penetrate the dark empath's usual capacity to externalize responsibility. And it requires a therapeutic relationship skilled enough to work with, rather than be manipulated by, the very empathic abilities that created the problem. So how do you recognize a dark empath before the damage is done? Before the dependency has been installed, before the perception has been eroded, before you are already explaining to yourself why your instincts must be wrong. The first signal is disproportionate attunement early in the relationship. The dark empath's attention, especially in the initial phases of a connection, can feel almost overwhelming in its accuracy. They seem to understand you faster than is reasonable. They reflect back your own thoughts with a precision that feels uncanny. This is not automatically a red flag. Some people are genuinely warm and perceptive. But it is a signal to pay attention, to watch what follows. The second signal is the pattern of intermittent availability. If someone's presence in your life feels addictive, if their absence creates a specific anxiety, if their return creates a specific relief that feels disproportionate to the length of their absence, that neurological signature is worth examining. Healthy relationships do not typically produce that quality of emotional volatility. The third signal is the subtle erosion of your own confidence in your perceptions. If you find yourself, in the context of a specific relationship, regularly second-guessing your own emotional responses, if you frequently end conversations with the sense that your feelings were somehow incorrect and their interpretation was somehow more accurate, this is one of the most reliable indicators of dark empathy at work. The fourth signal is the pattern of benefit. Map the relationship over time. Who has consistently benefited from the moments of greatest warmth? Whether the care has been genuinely reciprocal or whether it has tracked, with quiet precision, the moments when you had something to offer. Let us go to the substrate. Because the question of how high empathy and dark personality traits can coexist in the same mind is not just psychologically interesting, it is neurologically fascinating. Brain imaging studies have revealed that the neural circuitry underlying affective and cognitive empathy, while interconnected, are genuinely separable systems. The affective empathy system is centered in regions including the anterior insular and the anterior cingulate cortex, areas associated with emotional processing and the visceral experience of others' pain. The cognitive empathy system involves a different network, the temporoparietal junction, the medial prefrontal cortex, areas associated with theory of mind, the ability to model other people's mental states. Research on individuals with high psychopathic traits has revealed something striking. While these individuals typically show reduced activation in the affective empathy network, they feel less of what others feel. Their cognitive empathy networks can function at or above normal levels. They understand what others feel with considerable accuracy. They simply do not share it. In the dark empath specifically, the picture is more complex. Some studies suggest that affective empathy is not entirely absent, but is selectively activated, switched on when useful for social modeling, suppressed when it would interfere with goal pursuit. Whether this selective activation represents a learned behavioral strategy or a genuine neurological flexibility is an open question in the literature. But the practical implication is clear. The warmth you feel from a dark empath is not always purely performed. At the neurological level, something genuinely empathic may be occurring. The darkness is not in the absence of feeling. It is in the relationship between feeling and action. In the gap between accurately reading someone's vulnerability and choosing what to do with that information. Here is the larger implication that I want to sit with before we close. The one that extends beyond the specific psychology of the dark empath and into something more fundamental about how we understand human nature. Empathy is not a moral quality. It is a cognitive and emotional capacity. And like all capacities, it is morally neutral until it is directed. The scalpel and the weapon are both made of steel. The difference is not in the material. It is in the hand that holds it, and the intention behind the holding. This is deeply uncomfortable for a culture that has, particularly in the last 2 decades, elevated empathy to something close to a civic virtue. That has argued, in popular psychology, in education, in corporate culture, that if we could simply increase empathy levels we would produce more ethical individuals, more ethical organizations, more ethical societies. The research on dark empathy does not support this conclusion. It suggests something considerably more nuanced and considerably more demanding. Empathy without moral commitment is not compassion. It is a tool. And tools can be used for construction or for demolition. What determines the outcome is not the capacity itself, but the values, the conscience, the ethical framework within which the capacity operates. What this means practically is that the qualities we should be looking for in the people we trust, in the leaders we follow, in the partners we choose, are not simply warmth and attunement. They are the combination of warmth and attunement with something harder to measure and harder to perform. Consistency between private behavior and public presentation. The willingness to incur personal cost for ethical reasons. The track record, over time, of genuine reciprocity. Empathy you can feel in a single conversation. Character only reveals itself across time. There is a version of this episode that ends with a warning. A checklist of red flags. A protective strategy for avoiding dark empaths. But that is not the ending this topic deserves. Because the most important insight here is not defensive. It is structural. The dark empath exists at the intersection of two things we almost always treat as opposites. Genuine perceptiveness about others, and the willingness to use that perceptiveness for personal gain. And the fact that these things can coexist, not just in rare pathological cases but in a meaningful percentage of the general population, tells us something important about the nature of the mind. The capacity for understanding does not automatically produce the desire to protect. Feeling what someone feels does not automatically generate the ethical weight of responsibility for what they feel. These connections, between empathy and compassion, between understanding and care, between perception and protection, are not hardwired. They are built through culture, through family, through the moral frameworks we are given and the moral frameworks we choose. Which means they can be weakened. And they can be strengthened. The lesson of dark empathy is not that warmth is suspicious. It is not that genuine connection is dangerous. It is that genuine connection, sustained over time, in the full complexity of real circumstances, is the only reliable test of what is actually present beneath the warmth. Not the feeling in the first conversation. The pattern across 100 conversations. Not the care when you had something to offer. The care when you had nothing left to give. That is the echo that tells you what is real. This has been the echo principle. We map the unseen blueprints of human behavior so that you can finally learn to read the ones that were designed to stay invisible. We will see you in the next one.